"You may kiss the bride," the minister announced, and David's lips met mine with such tenderness and joy that the entire world seemed to crystallize into that single perfect moment. The crowd erupted in applause. Rose petals fell like snow around us, and I thought perhaps everything would be all right after all. The reception that followed was elegant beyond my wildest dreams. The Hartwell family had spared no expense: a 12-piece orchestra, cuisine prepared by a James Beard award-winning chef, champagne that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. The ballroom glowed with candlelight and crystal, flowers cascaded from every surface, and guests danced on floors that had once hosted American presidents and foreign dignitaries. But throughout the evening, I noticed the subtle ways Victoria continued to exclude me. When she gave her toast, she spoke eloquently about David's childhood, his accomplishments, the proud Hartwell legacy he would continue, but barely mentioned me except as David's lovely bride. When distant relatives asked about wedding photos, she directed them to albums that featured only the blood family portraits, as if the images with me didn't exist. "You're being paranoid," David whispered during our first dance, his breath warm against my ear as we swayed to the orchestra's rendition of "The Way You Look Tonight." "She's just traditional, old-fashioned. You'll see, once we have children, once you're really part of the family, everything will change." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But as I looked over his shoulder at Victoria, watching us dance with the calculating expression of someone planning their next move, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the September evening air. The rest of the reception passed in a blur of congratulations and small talk, dancing and champagne toasts. By the time David and I made our exit through a shower of rice and rose petals, I was exhausted not just from the long day, but from the constant vigilance required to navigate his family's subtle hostility. "We did it," David said as our limousine pulled away from the estate, his arm around me, his tie loosened and his face glowing with happiness. "We're married, Mrs. Hartwell." Mrs. Hartwell. I dreamed of hearing those words, of taking his name, of belonging to something bigger than myself. But as I settled against his shoulder, watching the Hartwell mansion disappear behind us, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd won the battle but was about to lose a much longer war. "The photographer will have the proofs ready next week," David continued, already planning our future with characteristic enthusiasm. "We'll get the most beautiful album made, something we can show our children and grandchildren someday." I nodded and smiled, playing the part of the blissful new bride. But privately I wondered which photographs would make it into that album. The formal family portraits where I was nowhere to be found, or the hastily arranged shots where I'd been, grudgingly included as an afterthought. As our honeymoon limousine wound through the New York countryside toward our weekend getaway at the family's Adirondack retreat, I made a silent promise to myself. I would find a way to belong in the Hartwell family, no matter what it took. I would earn Victoria's respect, prove my worth, show them that I was more than worthy of their son and their name. What I didn't know then was that Victoria Hartwell had made her own promises that night, her own plans for ensuring that despite the legal documents and ceremony, I would never truly be family. And she had weapons in her arsenal that I wouldn't discover for years, weapons that would make the wedding photo exclusion seem like a gentle warning shot. But that would all come later. For now, I was Mrs. Emma Hartwell, and I was determined to make that mean something, no matter what it cost me. 2 years into our marriage, I had learned to read Victoria Hartwell's tactics like a legal brief. Every carefully chosen word, every strategic pause, every seemingly innocent suggestion designed to reinforce my position as an outsider looking in. What I hadn't expected was how expertly she would use David's own love for me as a weapon against us both. "The Christmas portraits are scheduled for next Saturday," Victoria announced during our monthly family dinner at the estate, her silver fork pausing delicately over her Dover sole. "The photographer specifically requested we maintain consistency with previous years for the holiday cards." I looked up from my plate, already knowing where this was heading, but hoping I was wrong. That sounds lovely. What time should David and I arrive? The smile Victoria gave me could have frozen champagne. Oh, darling, these are for the annual family Christmas cards that go to our business associates and social circle. We've always kept them traditional. You understand? David's jaw tightened beside me, but he said nothing. 2 years of marriage, and I'd watched him navigate these conversations the same way every time. A moment of tension, a flash of protective anger, then the inevitable capitulation to family harmony. Traditional? I repeated carefully, setting down my own fork. You mean without me? It's not personal, Emma. Charles interjected from the head of the table, his voice carrying the dismissive tone reserved for unimportant business matters. The Christmas cards have featured the same family format for generations. Consistency is important for branding purposes. Branding. They were talking about their family like a corporate logo, and I was the unauthorized element that disrupted their carefully maintained image. Maybe we could do both, David suggested weakly. Traditional cards for business, and family cards that include Emma for friends. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something glacial settled in her eyes. That would be quite expensive, darling, and confusing for people. They wouldn't know which Emma they were supposed to acknowledge. The conversation moved on to other topics. Charles's latest board appointment, Victoria's charity committee, election, the renovations planned for the Martha's Vineyard house, but I barely heard any of it. I was too busy calculating just how many times over the past 2 years I'd been excluded from family traditions. The annual shareholder dinner for Hartwell Industries? Spouses aren't typically included in business functions, dear. The family reunion at the compound in Maine. It's really more of a blood relative gathering. The christening of David's cousin's baby? Such a small ceremony, we had to limit the guest list. Each exclusion came with perfectly reasonable explanations, plausible excuses that made me seem petty for objecting. But the pattern was unmistakable. Emma Hartwell existed in their world only when absolutely necessary, and even then, only at the margins. You're being too sensitive, David said as we drove home to our Upper East Side townhouse later that evening. His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, betraying his own frustration even as he defended his family. She doesn't mean it the way you think she does. Then how does she mean it? I turned in my seat to face him, studying the familiar profile I'd fallen in love with 3 years ago. Because from where I'm sitting, your mother has made it crystal clear that I'm not really family. That's not true. But his voice lacked conviction. She's particular about traditions. It's not about you personally, isn't it? I pulled out my phone, scrolling to the photo album I'd created over the past 2 years. Look at these, David. Really look. I showed him picture after picture from family events. Birthday parties where I appeared in casual snapshots but not the formal photos, holiday gatherings where I was cropped out of frame or standing awkwardly at the edge, anniversary celebrations where I seemed to exist in a parallel universe from the rest of the Hartwells. I see what you're showing me, he said quietly, pulling into our driveway. But what do you want me to do? Declare war on my mother over photographs? That was the question that had been eating at me for months. What did I want him to do? Stand up to the woman who had raised him, who controlled the family purse strings, who held the keys to his inheritance and his position at Hartwell Industries. Ask him to choose between his family and his wife? I want you to see that this isn't about photographs, I said finally. It's about respect. It's about whether I'm actually your wife or just someone you're sleeping with who happens to live in your house. David flinched as if I'd slapped him. That's not fair. Isn't it? I got out of the car, my heels clicking against the brick driveway. Your mother treats the housekeeper with more consideration than she shows me. The fight that followed was one of many we'd have over the coming months. David oscillating between defending his family and acknowledging their behavior, me growing, increasingly frustrated with his inability to take a firm stand. We loved each other desperately, but love wasn't enough to bridge the gap Victoria Hartwell had systematically created between us. The breaking point came 6 months later, at David's 32nd birthday party. Victoria had planned an elaborate celebration at the country club, black tie, 100 guests, society photographers documenting every moment for the social pages. I'd spent weeks preparing, commissioning a custom gown from David's favorite designer, studying up on the guest list so I could make intelligent conversation, practicing the kind of social graces that came naturally to women born into this world. "You look stunning," David whispered as we made our entrance, his hand warm and reassuring at the small of my back. "Absolutely radiant." For a moment, I felt like I belonged. The dress was perfect. Midnight blue silk that complemented my complexion, cut to showcase my figure without being inappropriate. My hair was styled in an elegant updo, my jewelry understated but expensive. I looked like I'd stepped out of the pages of Town and Country. The party was everything Victoria did well. Flawless execution, impeccable taste, the kind of event that would be talked about in society circles for months. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in crisp white linens. Centerpieces of white orchids and silver branches created dramatic focal points, and a string quartet played softly in the background. I worked the room like the lawyer. I was making conversation with David's Harvard Business School classmates, charming his father's golf partners, discussing art with the museum board members. For once, I felt like I was succeeding at this game, earning approving nods and genuine smiles from people who mattered in David's world. That's when Victoria announced the birthday toast. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying easily, across the ballroom as servers distributed champagne flutes, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." The room quieted, all eyes turning toward the small stage where Victoria stood in elegant silver silk, looking every inch the society matriarch. David moved to join her, his face glowing with the happiness I'd seen less and less of lately. 32 years ago, Victoria began, her voice warm with maternal pride. Charles and I were blessed with a son who has exceeded every dream we ever had for him. David has grown into a man of integrity, intelligence, and compassion, values instilled in him by 5 generations of Hartwell family tradition. She continued, painting a picture of David's childhood, his achievements, his promise for the future. But as she spoke, something cold began to settle in my stomach. She was talking about David as if he existed in isolation, as if the past 2 years of marriage had never happened. "As we look toward the future," Victoria said, raising her champagne flute, "we see a young man carrying forward the Hartwell legacy with honor and distinction, a man who makes his family proud every single day." The crowd raised their glasses, a murmur of approval rippling through the room. But Victoria wasn't finished. "Before we toast, I'd like to acknowledge some special people who've been instrumental in David's success." She gestured toward various sections of the room. His godfather, Senator Morrison, his mentor at the firm, Judge Patterson, his closest friends from Harvard and Yale. One by one, she recognized the important figures in David's life. Business partners, childhood friends, family members, all basking in the acknowledgement of their connection to the birthday boy. I waited for my name, my moment of recognition as the woman who shared his life, his dreams, his bed. It never came. Victoria concluded her speech without mentioning me once, not as David's wife, not as his partner, not even as a guest worthy of basic courtesy. In front of 100 people who knew we were married, she had systematically erased me from his narrative. The applause was enthusiastic, the toast heartfelt, but I felt like I was drowning in plain sight. David's face had gone pale during his mother's speech, his eyes finding mine across the room with an expression of horror and apology. But he didn't interrupt. He didn't correct her. He simply stood there and smiled while his mother publicly declared that his wife didn't exist. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and stilted conversation. I excused myself twice to the ladies' room, once to cry and once to vomit from the stress. Several guests approached me with sympathetic expressions, their discomfort at witnessing the snub obvious but unspoken. "Quite a party," murmured Patricia Whitman, the wife of David's business partner, as we both touched up our lipstick in the marble-appointed powder room. "Victoria certainly knows how to make a statement." I met her eyes in the mirror, seeing my own mortification reflected back. "She certainly does. For what it's worth," Patricia continued quietly, "my husband thinks you're the best thing that ever happened to David. Not everyone agrees with Victoria's approach. It was a small kindness, but it helped me get through the remainder of the evening." David and I barely spoke during the drive home, the weight of what had happened settling between us like a third passenger. "I'm sorry," he said finally as we pulled into our driveway. "I should have said something." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You should have. I'll talk to her. I'll make sure she understands." "No." I turned to face him, decision crystallizing in my mind. "Don't talk to her. Don't make excuses. Don't explain. Just don't. Emma, please. I know how this looked, but how it looked?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "David, your mother just spent 20 minutes talking about your life without mentioning that you have a wife. In front of our friends, our colleagues, our social circle. That's not how it looked. That's what happened." We sat in silence for several minutes, the engine ticking as it cooled, the weight of our marriage hanging in the balance. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally, the same question he'd been asking for 2 years. "I want you to choose," I said quietly. "I want you to decide whether you're married to me or to your mother's approval, because I can't keep living in this limbo where I'm your wife at home and your dirty secret everywhere else." The fight that followed was our worst. Yet, David accused me of being unreasonable, of not understanding the complexities of family dynamics, of expecting him to burn bridges over what he called petty slights. I accused him of being a coward, of prioritizing his inheritance over his marriage, of allowing his mother to systematically destroy his wife's dignity and self-respect. We said things that night that we couldn't take back. Drew lines in the sand that we couldn't uncross. By morning, we were sleeping in separate bedrooms and barely speaking. The Cold War that followed lasted 3 months. David threw himself into work, staying late at the office, traveling frequently, for business. I focused on my own career, taking on high-profile cases that required 60-hour weeks and constant travel. We were 2 people sharing a house but living separate lives, our marriage reduced to polite conversations about schedules and household logistics. Victoria, meanwhile, seemed delighted by the obvious strain in our relationship. She began calling David more frequently, dropping by the house unannounced, scheduling mother-son activities that coincidentally conflicted with any plans he might have made with me. It was masterfully done. She was simply being a loving mother, concerned about her son's well-being and availability. The reconciliation came on a Tuesday evening in March, when I returned from a week-long business trip to find David sitting in our living room with divorce papers spread across the coffee table. "I can't do this anymore," he said without looking up. "The fighting, the tension, the way we're both miserable. Maybe my mother was right. Maybe we're just too different." I stared at the papers, at the careful legal language that would dissolve our marriage and return us to our separate worlds. Part of me felt relief, an end to the constant battle, freedom, from Victoria's psychological warfare, the chance to build a life where I was valued and respected. But another part of me, the part that remembered why I'd fallen in love with David in the first place, rebelled against the idea of letting Victoria win. "Is this what you want?" I asked, sitting down across from him. "Really? Or is this what she wants?" David's hands shook as he picked up the papers. "Does it matter?" "This isn't working, Emma. We're destroying each other." "We're not destroying each other," I said firmly. "She is." For the first time in months, David really looked at me. I saw the man I'd married underneath the exhaustion and defeat, the man who'd once promised to love and cherish me for all the days of his life. "Then what do we do?" he asked quietly. "Because I can't choose between you and my family. I just can't." "You don't have to choose," I said, an idea beginning to form. "But you do have to fight." That night, we talked until dawn, not fighting, not accusing, but actually communicating about our marriage, our future, and what we were willing to do to save both. By morning, we had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in 2 years, I felt like we were truly partners again, and Victoria Hartwell was about to discover that her son's wife was much more formidable than she'd given me credit for. The real battle was just beginning. The plan David and I devised during our all-night reconciliation wasn't about confrontation. It was about documentation. As a lawyer, I understood the power of evidence, and over the next 18 months, we began systematically building a case that would eventually serve purposes neither of us could have imagined. "I need you to start recording everything," I told David as we sat in our study the morning after our decision to fight back. "Every conversation with your mother, every family gathering, every instance where I'm excluded or dismissed. We need contemporaneous documentation." David looked uncomfortable with the idea of essentially spying on his own family, but he nodded grimly. "What are you thinking? Some kind of intervention? Family therapy?" I smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I'm thinking we need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we decide how to handle it. Your mother is sophisticated, David. She's been playing this game for decades. We need to learn her patterns, her strategies, her weaknesses." What I didn't tell him was that my legal mind was already working on multiple levels. Documentation for a potential confrontation, yes, but also protection for our marriage, evidence for any future legal proceedings, and leverage for scenarios I hoped we'd never need to consider. The first test of our new alliance came just 2 weeks later, at Easter dinner. Victoria had planned her usual elaborate celebration at the estate, formal dining room, ancestral china, table settings that required a placement chart. As David and I arrived, I noticed the familiar tightness in his jaw that indicated he was preparing for battle. "Remember," I whispered as we walked up the front steps, "document everything. Mental notes now, written records tonight. The seating. Arrangement told the story before a word was spoken." Victoria had placed me at the far end of the table, between David's elderly great-aunt Margaret, who was nearly deaf, and Charles's business partner's wife, who spoke primarily about her prize-winning orchids. David sat near the head of the table, flanked by family members and close friends, positioned to participate in the real conversations, while I was relegated to the conversational equivalent of Siberia. "Emma, dear," Victoria called out from her position at the head of the table. "Margaret was just telling us about her recent cataract surgery. I thought you might be interested being in healthcare law." I wasn't in healthcare law. I specialized in corporate mergers and acquisitions, a fact Victoria knew perfectly well since she'd made pointed comments about my aggressive career choices on multiple occasions. But the comment served its purpose. It demonstrated her indifference to my actual profession, while giving her an excuse to exclude me from more substantive discussions. "Actually," I replied smoothly, "I practice corporate law, but I'm certainly interested in Margaret's recovery." The slight tightening around Victoria's eyes told me she'd caught the correction and wasn't pleased by it. Good. For too long, I'd let her mischaracterizations slide in the interest of family harmony. No more. Throughout the dinner, I watched and listened with the methodical attention I brought to depositions. Victoria's tactics were subtle but systematic. She dominated conversation topics, ensuring discussions remained focused on subjects where I had little to contribute. Family, history, social connections predating my arrival, business matters from which I was excluded. When I did attempt to join conversations, she employed a variety of dismissive techniques, suddenly remembering urgent matters to discuss with other family members, changing subjects abruptly, or simply talking over me as if I hadn't spoken. But the most revealing moment came during dessert, when Charles raised his glass for a toast. "To family traditions," he began, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. "To the bonds that tie us together across generations, and to the values that make us who we are." As glasses clinked around the table, I noticed Victoria's eyes settle on me with something approaching satisfaction. The message was clear. Traditions and bonds and values were things I could never truly share, no matter how long I remained married to David. That night, David and I sat in our study with legal pads, reconstructing the evening with the precision of court reporters. "She seated you next to Margaret deliberately," David said, writing notes in his careful script. "Margaret's been deaf for 3 years, and Mrs. Henderson hasn't talked about anything but orchids since 1987. The healthcare law comment was particularly nice," I added dryly, making sure everyone knows she doesn't consider my actual career worth remembering. "I counted 7 times she interrupted or redirected when you tried to speak," David continued, his anger finally showing through his controlled facade. "And twice she brought up family memories specifically from before we met, making sure you knew you weren't part of the history." As we documented Victoria's behavior, patterns began to emerge that were even more systematic than I'd realized. She had developed an entire arsenal of exclusion techniques, each deniable individually but devastating in their cumulative effect. "David," I said slowly, a thought crystallizing, "how long has she been doing this? I mean, with other people who married into the family?" He looked up from his notes, considering. "You know, I never really thought about it, but my cousin Richard's wife divorced him after 3 years, said she couldn't handle the family pressure. And Uncle William's second wife, she lasted maybe 2 years before she moved back to California. What about the ones who stayed? Who survived?" David was quiet for a long moment. "They adapted, became smaller, I guess, more willing to accept whatever role they were given." The implication hung in the air between us. Victoria's behavior wasn't personal, it was policy. A systematic method for maintaining family hierarchy and ensuring that newcomers understood their place in the Hartwell ecosystem. Armed with this understanding, we began our campaign of strategic resistance. The next family gathering was Charles's birthday celebration in May. This time, we came prepared. "I'll take the seat next to you," I told Victoria as we entered the dining room, smiling pleasantly as I moved toward the chair beside her usual position. "I've been looking forward to hearing about your charity work." The micro-expression of annoyance that crossed Victoria's face was quickly suppressed, but David and I both caught it. She'd expected me to meekly accept whatever seat she'd assigned, as I had for the past 3 years. "How lovely," she replied, her tone suggesting it was anything but. Though I was hoping to discuss some family business with David tonight. "Of course," I said, settling into the chair with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "I'll be interested to hear about that too. As David's wife, family business affects me as well." It was a small victory, but significant. For the first time, I'd claimed space at Victoria's table, literally and figuratively, and made it clear I wasn't going to be marginalized without a fight. Throughout the evening, I employed techniques I'd learned in courtrooms and boardrooms. When Victoria attempted to redirect conversations away from me, I politely but firmly brought them back. When she tried to exclude me from family discussions, I asked direct questions that required acknowledgement. When she made her subtle digs, I responded with equally subtle corrections. "Emma's been so busy with her little legal cases," Victoria commented during the main course, the diminutive little designed to minimize my professional achievements. "Yes, the Morrison Industries merger has been quite complex," I replied smoothly. $300 million in assets requires careful attention to detail. David suppressed a smile. Morrison Industries was one of Charles's biggest competitors, and my successful handling of their expansion had been featured in the business pages just last week. The real breakthrough came when Victoria attempted her usual Easter gambit, bringing up family memories from before my time to emphasize my outsider status. "Do you remember, David, when you were 12 and you organized that elaborate treasure hunt for Christmas? You had the whole family searching the grounds for clues." "Actually," I interjected before David could respond, "that sounds like something our children might enjoy someday. David's told me he wants to carry on family traditions with the next generation." The mention of potential grandchildren, Victoria's ultimate weakness, changed the entire dynamic of the conversation. Suddenly, I wasn't just an interloper disrupting family harmony. I was the potential mother of future Hartwells, which gave me currency in Victoria's world that I'd never possessed before. "Children," Victoria repeated, her tone carefully neutral. "Have you and David been planning?" "We've been discussing it," I replied, meeting her gaze steadily. "David thinks 3 would be ideal. I'm partial to 4 myself." It was a complete fabrication. David and I had barely touched on the subject of children beyond vague someday conversations. But the strategic value was undeniable. Victoria's entire approach to me shifted in that moment, her calculating mind recognizing that open warfare with the potential mother of her grandchildren might not be in her best interests. The rest of the evening proceeded with notably less hostility. Victoria still maintained her superior attitude, but the sharp edges were dulled by the possibility that I might soon serve a purpose she actually valued. "That was brilliant," David said as we drove home. "You completely changed the game by bringing up children." "It bought us breathing room," I agreed. "But it also created expectations we'll have to manage carefully." Over the following months, our strategic approach continued to evolve. We developed techniques for handling Victoria's various manipulation tactics, established boundaries that we enforced consistently, and began documenting not just the obvious slights, but the subtle patterns of behavior that revealed the depth of her campaign against me. The most significant development came in September, when David's grandfather's health began to fail rapidly. Harrison Hartwell was 91 years old, sharp as a blade despite his physical frailty, and the undisputed patriarch of the family. Unlike Victoria, he'd always treated me with old-fashioned courtesy, if not warmth. But as his condition deteriorated, family dynamics began to shift in ways none of us anticipated. "Grandfather wants to see you," David told me after returning from a visit to the old man's bedside. "Both of us. He says he has things to discuss while he still can." Victoria's face when she learned about this private audience was a study in barely controlled fury. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely rattled. "I can't imagine what Father might want to discuss that couldn't include the entire family," she said, her voice tight with disapproval. But Harrison Hartwell had made his wishes clear, and even Victoria didn't dare contradict the family patriarch directly. The meeting took place in Harrison's private study, a room I'd never been invited to enter before. Surrounded by leather-bound books, family portraits spanning 5 generations, and the accumulated treasures of a long and successful life, the old man looked small but determined. "Emma," he said, his voice still carrying the authority that had built a business empire. "I owe you an apology." I blinked in surprise. "Sir? I've watched how my daughter-in-law has treated you these past 3 years. I told myself it was just her way, that she'd come around eventually. But I've been foolish and unfair, and I'm sorry." David's hand found mine, squeezing gently as we absorbed this unexpected development. "Victoria has always been protective of the family," Harrison continued. "She lost her first child, David's older brother, when he was just 6 months old. It changed something in her, made her guard what remained with fierce intensity. But that's not an excuse for cruelty. The revelation about David's older brother was news to me, though it explained some of Victoria's possessive behavior toward her surviving son. "I'm 91 years old," Harrison said, his eyes moving between David and me. "I won't see many, more birthdays, but there are things I need to put right before I go, and this is one of them." He reached for a folder on his desk, his movements careful but purposeful. "I've been reviewing my will, making final adjustments. There are provisions I want to discuss with both of you, privately, before the formal reading. What Harrison told us in that room would change everything, not just about our relationship with Victoria, but about the entire balance of power in the Hartwell family." As his words sank in, I realized that our months of strategic documentation and careful positioning had been preparing us for a battle far more significant than we'd ever imagined. But that knowledge would remain our secret for now. Harrison made us promise not to reveal what he'd shared until after his death, when the will would speak for itself. "The next few months won't be easy," the old man warned as our meeting concluded. "Victoria will sense that something has changed, even if she doesn't know what. Be careful, be smart, and remember that sometimes the most important victories are the ones no one sees coming." As we left Harrison's study that evening, I felt the weight of new knowledge and new responsibility. The game Victoria and I had been playing was about to change dramatically, with stakes none of us had fully understood. But for now, we would continue our careful documentation, our strategic resistance, our patient building of evidence and alliance. Because when the moment came, and Harrison's words suggested it would come soon, we would be ready. The old patriarch died peacefully in his sleep just 6 weeks later, taking with him the last restraining influence on Victoria's behavior and leaving behind a will that would shatter the Hartwell family's carefully maintained facade forever. Harrison Hartwell's funeral was everything Victoria orchestrated best. A masterpiece of social theater that showcased the family's prominence, while reinforcing their carefully maintained hierarchy. Standing in the receiving line at the wake, I watched her work the crowd with the skill of a seasoned politician, accepting condolences while simultaneously managing family positioning and controlling the narrative of grief. "Such a loss for all of us," she murmured to the endless stream of visitors, her black Chanel suit impeccable, her silver hair styled in perfect waves despite the early morning call that had summoned us to the hospital. "Father lived such a full life, surrounded by family who loved him." The emphasis on family wasn't lost on me, nor was the way she positioned herself as the primary mourner, while relegating David and me to supporting roles in her carefully choreographed performance. But what struck me most was the nervous energy underneath her composed facade, a tension I'd never seen before in 3 years of observing her manipulations. "She knows," David whispered to me during a brief lull in the receiving line. "She can sense that something's changed, but she doesn't know what." Harrison's warning echoed in my mind. Victoria would sense that something had shifted, even without knowing the specific details. And judging by her behavior over the past week, she was already moving to consolidate control before any threats could materialize. The funeral service itself was held at St. Patrick's Cathedral, befitting the Hartwell family's social status and Harrison's decades of charitable contributions. I sat in the second pew with David, directly behind Victoria and Charles, close enough to observe the subtle ways she continued to manage family dynamics even in grief. When the pastor invited family members to share memories, Victoria stood first, delivering a polished eulogy that painted Harrison as the devoted family patriarch whose greatest joy came from watching his descendants carry on his legacy. She spoke movingly about his business acumen, his charitable work, his commitment to family values, but conspicuously avoided mentioning his final months, when he'd grown increasingly critical of family divisions and openly concerned about ensuring justice for all family members. "Grandfather would have wanted David to speak," I murmured, noting how Victoria had efficiently claimed the spotlight while bypassing her son entirely. But David seemed content to let his mother control the narrative, his own grief genuine and raw in a way that made him vulnerable to her machinations. I squeezed his hand, offering comfort while mentally noting another instance of Victoria's strategic positioning. The burial at Woodlawn Cemetery was restricted to immediate family, which meant I was technically included, but emotionally isolated. As we stood around the gravesite, I found myself studying the elaborate family mausoleum with its carefully arranged headstones marking 5 generations of Hartwells. Soon Harrison's name would join the others, another patriarch laid to rest with the pomp befitting his station. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust," the minister intoned, and I watched Victoria's face as dirt scattered across her father-in-law's casket. For just a moment, her mask slipped, revealing something that looked almost like fear. The reception afterward was held at the estate, naturally. Victoria had transformed the main drawing room into a shrine to Harrison's memory, with photo displays, chronicling his life from childhood through his final years. I wandered through the exhibit with morbid fascination, noting how the narrative she'd constructed carefully emphasized certain aspects of his legacy while obscuring others. The business achievements were prominently featured: Harrison's expansion of Hartwell Industries, his various board positions, his reputation as a pillar of New York society. Family photos showed him with multiple generations of Hartwells, always positioned as the beloved patriarch surrounded by devoted descendants. But there were no pictures from his final months, no documentation of his growing concern about family, unity, no evidence of the private conversations he'd begun having with various family members about fairness and justice. Victoria had curated his memory as efficiently as she curated everything else, presenting a version of Harrison that supported her vision of family hierarchy. "Quite a display," commented Eleanor Whitfield, Harrison's longtime secretary, appearing beside me as I studied a particular photo arrangement. At 82, Eleanor had worked for the family for nearly 4 decades and had witnessed the evolution of Hartwell dynamics from a unique vantage point. "It captures his public life beautifully," I replied carefully, unsure where Eleanor's loyalties. Eleanor's sharp eyes met mine with something approaching understanding. Mr. Harrison was complex in his final years. He spent a lot of time thinking about legacy, about what really mattered. Not all of that thinking made it into Mrs. Victoria's tribute. Before I could respond, Eleanor had moved away, leaving me with the distinct impression that she knew more about Harrison's final intentions than she was prepared to discuss in public. The week following the funeral brought a flurry of family business meetings, estate settlements, and what Victoria termed organizational necessities. As Harrison's death created a power vacuum at the head of the family, she moved swiftly to establish herself as the new matriarch, making decisions and issuing directives with increased authority. "The will reading is scheduled for Friday," David told me after returning from yet another family meeting at Victoria's home. "Just immediate family and the lawyers." "Did she say anything about the contents?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Victoria had been remarkably tight-lipped about inheritance details, which was unusual given her tendency to manage information flow. She seems to think it's straightforward. Standard distribution among children and grandchildren, with her and father taking control of the business interests. David paused, studying my face. "But you know something, don't you? From that meeting with grandfather." I nodded slowly. Harrison had sworn us to secrecy, but with the will reading approaching, the time for revelation was at hand. "It's not what she expects, David. Not at all." The anticipation of what was coming made the remaining days before the reading almost unbearable. Victoria's behavior grew increasingly erratic as she sensed undercurrents she couldn't control. She called more frequent family meetings, scheduled additional social obligations, and generally ramped up her efforts to maintain dominance through sheer force of activity. "She's nervous," I observed to David as we dressed for yet another family dinner. "She's trying to establish normalcy and control before something disrupts her plans." The dinner that night was particularly revealing. Victoria had invited extended family members who rarely appeared at casual gatherings, cousins from the West Coast, business partners who weren't typically included in personal events, even Eleanor Whitfield, who usually maintained strict boundaries between professional and family interactions. "Such a blessing to have everyone together during this difficult time," Victoria announced as we gathered in the formal dining room. Father would have been so pleased to see the family united in his memory. But the gathering felt less like unity and more like a strategic positioning exercise. Victoria made sure to seat herself at the head of the table, with Charles to her right, and the most influential family members arranged according to their perceived importance. David and I found ourselves in the middle section, not quite relegated to the children's table, but certainly not positioned as key players in whatever drama was unfolding. Throughout the meal, Victoria steered conversation toward topics that reinforced her authority. Her plans for continuing Harrison's charitable work, her vision for the family business, her thoughts on maintaining traditions that had served the Hartwells for generations. It was a masterclass in preemptive damage control, establishing her version of the future before anyone could challenge it. "Emma, dear," she said during dessert, her tone carrying the false warmth I'd learned to recognize as particularly dangerous. "I hope you understand how much we appreciate your patience during this difficult period. I know family business can be overwhelming for someone from a different background." The comment was vintage Victoria, superficially considerate while actually dismissive, acknowledging my presence while emphasizing my outsider status. But this time, instead of the usual sting of exclusion, I felt something approaching pity for her desperate attempts to maintain control. "Thank you, Victoria," I replied evenly. "I'm grateful to be part of a family that values loyalty and fairness." The emphasis on fairness was deliberate, and I saw her eyes narrow slightly as she caught the implication. Something was coming that she couldn't control or predict, and my calm confidence suggested I knew more than I was revealing. The evening ended with Victoria's announcement that she would be hosting a family brunch on Sunday, after the will reading, to discuss our path forward as a family. The timing wasn't coincidental. She was planning to use whatever leverage the will provided to cement her position as family leader. "She's so certain she knows what's in that will," David mused as we drove home. "What did grandfather tell us? That she doesn't know?" I thought back to that afternoon in Harrison's study, to the old man's careful explanations and his insistence on secrecy. The provisions he'd outlined were indeed unexpected, but they were also profoundly just in ways that Victoria would never appreciate. "He saw things differently than she realized," I said finally. He'd been watching the family dynamics for years, taking notes, making judgments, and he didn't like what he saw. Thursday brought unexpected drama in the form of a visit from Eleanor Whitfield. She appeared at our townhouse that evening, looking uncharacteristically nervous and carrying a manila envelope. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," she said as I invited her into our living room. "But there are things I need to tell you before tomorrow's reading, things Mr. Harrison wanted you to know." David joined us, and Eleanor settled into her chair, with the careful movements of someone carrying a significant burden. "I worked for your grandfather for 38 years, she began, addressing David directly. "In all that time, I never saw him as concerned about family matters as he was these past 2 years. He spent hours talking about fairness, about making sure the right people were protected and rewarded." She opened the manila envelope, revealing a thick stack of handwritten notes in Harrison's distinctive script. "He asked me to give these to you after his death, but before the will reading. He wanted you to understand his reasoning, his observations, his concerns about certain family members." As Eleanor read excerpts from Harrison's private notes, a clear picture emerged of an old man who had watched his daughter-in-law's systematic campaign against me with growing dismay and anger. The notes documented specific incidents: family gatherings where I'd been excluded, social events where I'd been marginalized, conversations where Victoria had spoken dismissively about my background and worth. He was particularly troubled by the wedding photography incident, Eleanor continued, reading from one of the later entries. He saw it as emblematic of a pattern of cruelty that had no place in a family that claimed to value integrity and kindness. But the notes revealed something even more significant. Harrison had spent his final years investigating not just Victoria's treatment of me, but her management of family finances, her influence over business decisions, and her systematic exclusion of family members who didn't meet her approval. "There were others before you," Eleanor explained, looking up from the notes. "Wives and daughters-in-law who were driven away, potential heirs who were marginalized, family members who were quietly excluded from inheritance considerations because they didn't conform to Mrs. Victoria's vision of acceptable behavior." The pattern was extensive and deliberate, documented in Harrison's careful handwriting with the precision of a man building a legal case. He had witnessed decades of Victoria's manipulations and had finally decided to act. "The will," Eleanor said, returning the notes to their envelope, "reflects his conclusions about what would be most fair and most beneficial for the family's future. I think you'll find tomorrow's reading quite illuminating." After Eleanor left, David and I sat in stunned silence, processing the implications of what we'd learned. Harrison's investigation had been far more thorough than we'd realized, his conclusions more damning, his planned response more dramatic. "She has no idea what's coming," David said finally. "No," I agreed, feeling a complex mixture of anticipation and sympathy. "She really doesn't." Friday morning dawned gray and drizzly, as if the weather were reflecting the family's collective mood. The will reading was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the offices of Harrison's longtime attorney, Edmund Blackwell, in a conference room overlooking Central Park. As David and I prepared to leave for what we knew would be a day that changed everything, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. 3 years of systematic exclusion, months of careful documentation, weeks of growing tension, all leading to this final confrontation between Victoria's version of family hierarchy and Harrison's vision of justice. "Whatever happens today," David said as we walked toward our car, "I want you to know that I'm proud of how you've handled everything. You've been stronger and more gracious than I had any right to expect." I squeezed his hand, thinking of all the battles we'd fought and the alliance we'd built. We've been strong together. That's what matters. The ride to the lawyer's office was quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts about what the morning would bring. But as we approached the building where Harrison's final wishes would be revealed, I felt a sense of anticipation rather than anxiety. Justice, after all, was something I understood. And Harrison Hartwell, it seemed, had understood it too. The conference room at Blackwell, Morrison & Associates was designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, a mahogany table that could seat 20, walls lined, with leather-bound legal volumes that spoke of decades of high-stakes negotiations. As family members filed in for Harrison's will reading, the tension was palpable enough to cut with a knife. Victoria entered first, naturally, wearing a perfectly tailored black suit that managed to convey both grief and authority. She moved, with the confidence of someone expecting confirmation of her assumptions, taking the chair at the head of the table as if it were her birthright. Charles followed, looking uncomfortable in a way that suggested he knew more about potential surprises than his usual demeanor indicated. David's cousins arrived in clusters, the California contingent who rarely visited New York, the Boston branch, who'd built their own successful ventures, the younger generation who'd been kept at arm's length from family business decisions. As they arranged themselves around the massive table, I noticed the subtle hierarchies that had been established over decades. Who sat closest to Victoria? Who merited acknowledgement? who was relegated to the periphery. "Emma, dear," Victoria called out as David and I approached the table. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in one of the chairs along the wall. These proceedings can be quite lengthy and technical." It was exactly the kind of maneuver I'd come to expect, a suggestion that sounded considerate but was actually designed to reinforce my outsider status. In Victoria's world, the will reading was family business, and despite 3 years of marriage, I remained an observer rather than a participant. But Edmund Blackwell, Harrison's attorney for over 40 years, intervened before I could respond. "Actually, Mrs. Victoria," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to managing difficult clients, "Mrs. Emma Hartwell is specifically mentioned in the will and needs to be seated at the table." Mr. Harrison was quite explicit about the seating arrangements. The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing surprise and something approaching alarm before she recovered her social mask. "Of course," she said smoothly, though her eyes had gone glacial. "I simply assumed. Please, everyone take your seats," Blackwell continued, consulting a handwritten seating chart. Mr. Harrison provided specific instructions about today's proceedings. As we arranged ourselves according to Harrison's posthumous orchestration, I found myself seated directly across from Victoria, with David beside me and Eleanor Whitfield positioned at the far end of the table with a stack of documents. The positioning felt deliberate, as if Harrison had been staging this confrontation from beyond the grave. Blackwell began with the standard legal preamble: declarations of sound mind, revocation of previous wills, appointment of executors. But as he progressed through the document, it became clear that Harrison's final testament was anything but standard. "To my beloved family," Blackwell read, his voice carrying Harrison's words across the assembled group. "I have spent considerable time in my final years observing the dynamics that govern our relationships with one another. What I have witnessed has both pleased and troubled me, and this will reflect my conclusions about what is best for our family's future." Victoria's fingers drummed silently against the mahogany table, the only outward sign of her growing agitation. "I have always believed that character matters more than bloodline, that kindness matters more than social position, and that integrity matters more than wealth. These beliefs have shaped how I have chosen to distribute my earthly possessions." 3. First few bequests were relatively conventional: charitable donations to Harrison's favorite causes, personal items distributed among various family members, modest financial gifts to longtime employees. But as Blackwell continued reading, the nature of Harrison's intentions became increasingly clear. "To Eleanor Whitfield, who has served our family with loyalty and discretion for nearly 4 decades, I leave the sum of $5 million and a lifetime residence in the carriage house of the Connecticut estate, with deep gratitude for her steadfast service and friendship." Eleanor's face went white with shock, her hands trembling as she absorbed the magnitude of the bequest. Around the table, family members exchanged glances. $5 million was a substantial sum, far more than the token amounts typically left to longtime employees. "To my grandchildren who have shown commitment to family values and personal integrity," Blackwell continued, "I leave individual trust funds of $2 million each, to be administered according to their demonstrated character and judgment." This was where things began to get interesting. As Blackwell read the specific provisions for each grandchild, it became apparent that Harrison had been making judgments based on behavior rather than birth order or traditional expectations. David's cousin Jennifer, who had devoted her career to nonprofit work despite family pressure to join the business, received additional provisions for her charitable foundation. Another cousin, who had been quietly supporting his ex-wife and children despite a difficult divorce, found his trust enhanced with educational funds for his kids. But David's cousin Marcus, who had a reputation for entitled behavior and financial irresponsibility, discovered his inheritance came with strict oversight provisions and behavioral requirements. "What the hell does that mean?" Marcus demanded, his face flushed with indignation. Behavioral requirements? Blackwell consulted his notes calmly. It means, Mr. Marcus, that your grandfather observed certain patterns of conduct that concerned him. Your trust fund will be administered by independent trustees who will evaluate your spending and lifestyle choices. Continued access to funds depends on demonstrating maturity and responsibility. Victoria's expression had progressed from surprise to barely controlled fury as she realized Harrison had been making character assessments that contradicted her own family valuations. The old man had been watching, judging, and planning consequences for behavior she thought had gone unnoticed. Now we come to the primary estate distribution, Blackwell announced, shuffling to a new section of the will. These decisions reflect Mr. Harrison's careful consideration of what would best serve the family's long-term interests and values. The room held its collective breath. To my son Charles, who has served the family business with dedication and competence, I leave 40% of Hartwell Industries stock, the Manhattan penthouse, and liquid assets totaling $15 million. Charles nodded grimly, clearly expecting this level of inheritance but perhaps hoping for more. To my daughter-in-law Victoria, Blackwell continued, and I could see her straighten in anticipation. I leave the Connecticut estate, personal jewelry and artwork valued at approximately $3 million, and a lifetime annuity of $200,000 per year. The numbers were significant, but notably less than Victoria had obviously expected. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were now clenched in her lap. However, Blackwell added, consulting another page, these bequests come with specific conditions that reflect Mr. Harrison's observations about family dynamics and personal conduct. The lawyer's tone had become more formal, as if he were reading charges in a criminal proceeding. Mr. Harrison noted with concern certain patterns of behavior that he felt were detrimental to family unity and contrary to the values he hoped to instill in future generations. Specifically, he documented instances of deliberate exclusion, systematic undermining of family members, and what he termed social cruelty masquerading as tradition. Victoria's face had gone from pale to ashen. Around the table, family members began to understand that this wasn't just a will reading, it was a reckoning. The conditions attached to Mrs. Victoria's inheritance require her to participate in family counseling sessions designed to address these concerning behaviors, and to make public acknowledgement of past treatment of family members that fell short of acceptable standards. This is outrageous, Victoria finally found her voice, standing abruptly. I won't sit here and listen to character assassination from a dead man who clearly wasn't in his right mind. Mrs. Victoria, Blackwell replied calmly, your father-in-law anticipated this reaction. He included extensive documentation of his mental competency, including recent psychiatric evaluations confirming his sound judgment. He also provided detailed evidence supporting his observations about family dynamics. Eleanor Whitfield stood and began distributing copies of documents. Around the table, photographs, email printouts, handwritten notes, recorded conversation transcripts. The evidence Harrison had been gathering for years, all meticulously organized and legally admissible. What is this? Victoria demanded, staring at a photograph of our wedding day that clearly showed her orchestrating my exclusion from family. Portraits. Documentation, Blackwell replied simply. Mr. Harrison believed in building strong cases for his positions. As family members examined the evidence, a clear picture emerged of Victoria's systematic campaign of exclusion and manipulation. There were photographs from dozens of family events showing deliberate positioning to marginalize certain individuals, email chains revealing strategic planning to undermine relationships, even audio recordings of conversations where Victoria discussed her methods for maintaining family hierarchy. But the most significant portion of the estate, Blackwell continued, ignoring Victoria's sputtering protests, goes to individuals Mr. Harrison believed embodied the values he most cherished. My heart began racing as I realized we were approaching the moment Harrison had warned us about. To my grandson David, who has shown loyalty, integrity, and the courage to build a marriage based on genuine partnership rather than social convenience. I leave 30% of Hartwell Industries stock and the primary family residence in the Hamptons. David's inheritance was substantial, but the phrasing suggested there was more to come. And to Emma Hartwell, whose grace under pressure and commitment to family unity, despite systematic exclusion and mistreatment, has demonstrated the kind of character this family needs, I leave 20% of Hartwell Industries stock, the Martha's Vineyard property and liquid assets totaling $10 million. The silence that followed was absolute. I stared at Blackwell, unable to process what I'd just heard. 20% of one of New York's most successful private companies, plus millions in additional assets. It was more money than I'd ever imagined, but more importantly, it represented something I'd never expected to receive: validation. Furthermore, Blackwell continued, Mr. Harrison has appointed Emma Hartwell as co-executor of his estate, with specific responsibility for ensuring that the charitable provisions and family counseling requirements are properly implemented. Victoria had gone from ashen to purple with rage. This is impossible. She's not even really family. She's been married to David for 3 years. 3 years. And you're telling me my father-in-law left her a fortune and put her in charge of family business? Actually, Blackwell replied, consulting his notes. Mr. Harrison's letter of explanation addresses this concern directly. May I read the relevant passage? Without waiting for permission, he continued. Emma Hartwell has shown more commitment to family values in 3 years than some members have demonstrated in decades. She has endured systematic exclusion and deliberate humiliation with dignity and grace. She has supported her husband through difficult family dynamics without creating drama or divisions. Most importantly, she has tried repeatedly to build genuine relationships despite facing obstacles that would have driven away someone with less integrity. If character and contribution determine family membership, then Emma Hartwell is more deserving of the Hartwell name than individuals who have used their birthright as a license for cruelty. The words hit like physical blows, each sentence a precise indictment of Victoria's behavior. Around the table, family members were staring at the evidence packages, seeing their own family dynamics from Harrison's judgmental perspective. There's more, Blackwell announced. Mr. Harrison has established a foundation dedicated to supporting individuals who have faced workplace harassment and social exclusion, with Emma Hartwell designated as the founding president. The foundation will be funded with $50 million from the estate. I felt David's hand find mine under the table, squeezing tightly as we absorbed the magnitude of Harrison's final statement. He hadn't just vindicated my place in the family. He'd weaponized his wealth to ensure that others facing similar treatment would have resources and support. The remaining estate provisions, Blackwell continued methodically, include specific requirements for how family gatherings will be conducted, protocols for inclusion in family photographs and events, and consequences for continued exclusionary behavior. Victoria finally found her voice again, though it was shaking with rage. I'll contest this will. No court in the world will uphold provisions based on subjective character judgments and family therapy requirements. Mrs. Victoria, Blackwell replied, his patience clearly tested. Your father-in-law anticipated this response as well. The will has been reviewed by 3 independent legal teams, all of whom have confirmed its enforceability. Additionally, Mr. Harrison included a specific provision. Any beneficiary who contests the will forfeits their inheritance entirely, with their portion redistributed among the charitable beneficiaries. The threat was clear and legally binding. Victoria could fight the will, but doing so would cost her everything Harrison had left her. This isn't over, she said finally, gathering her purse with shaking hands. This family will not be destroyed by the delusions of a senile old man and the manipulations of an opportunistic outsider. She swept from the room with as much dignity as she could muster, Charles following reluctantly behind her. But the damage was done, the new reality established. Harrison Hartwell had used his final act to completely restructure the family power dynamics, elevating those he considered worthy while imposing consequences on those who had abused their positions. As the other family members filed out, most stopping to congratulate David and me with expressions ranging from genuine warmth to strategic calculation, I remained seated at the mahogany table, still processing what had happened. "Mrs. Hartwell," Blackwell said, approaching with a final envelope, "your grandfather-in-law asked me to give you this privately after the others had left." Inside was a handwritten letter in Harrison's careful script. "Dear Emma, if you are reading this, then my final gamble has played out as planned. I have watched you for 3 years, seen how you've handled Victoria's campaign against you, observed your grace under pressure and your refusal to abandon your integrity despite significant provocation. You never asked for wealth or position, you simply asked to be treated with basic human dignity. That such a reasonable request was denied reveals everything anyone needs to know about the character of those who denied it. The money and stock I've left you represent more than inheritance. They represent power. Use that power wisely, not for revenge, but for justice. Help others who face what you have faced. Build the kind of family culture you wished you had found when you married David. Victoria will never forgive you for this, but forgiveness was never possible anyway. At least now you have the resources to protect yourself and others from her particular brand of cruelty. Welcome to the family, my dear. You've earned your place in ways that matter far more than blood or marriage certificates. With respect and affection, Harrison Hartwell, Asai. I folded the letter. I realized that everything had changed in the space of 2 hours. I was no longer the excluded daughter-in-law fighting for scraps of acceptance. I was now one of the most powerful members of the Hartwell family, with both the resources and the mandate to reshape how that family operated. Victoria's war against me had not only failed, it had spectacularly backfired, resulting in my elevation to a position where I could ensure that no one else would face what I had endured. The battle was over. But as Harrison had warned, Victoria would never forgive this reversal of fortune. The real challenge would be managing the aftermath of his devastating final judgment and using my new power to build something better from the ruins of the old. Family order. The 48 hours following the will reading felt like living in the eye of a hurricane, an eerie calm surrounded by the promise of devastating winds. David and I returned to our townhouse in stunned silence, both of us struggling to process the magnitude of what had transpired in that mahogany-paneled conference room. 20%, David kept repeating as we sat in our living room. Harrison's letter spread between us on the coffee table. Grandfather left you 20% of the company. That makes you the 3rd largest shareholder, Emma. Do you understand what that means? I was beginning to. Along with David's 30% and Charles's 40%, I now held enough voting power to influence every major business decision. More importantly, I held enough leverage to ensure that Victoria's social manipulations could never again be backed by economic threats. "She's going to come after us," I said quietly, thinking of the expression on Victoria's face as she'd stormed from the conference room. "This isn't over for her. It's just beginning." David nodded grimly. "She's probably meeting with her lawyers right now, looking for any possible way to contest the will or minimize its impact." As if summoned by our conversation, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Eleanor Whitfield's number. "Mrs. Emma." Eleanor's voice was tight with urgency. "I thought you should know. Mrs. Victoria has been calling all afternoon, trying to schedule meetings with various family members. She's also been in contact with several business journalists, claiming there are irregularities in Mr. Harrison's will that need investigation." The counterattack was beginning exactly as I'd expected. Victoria was moving on multiple fronts simultaneously. Legal challenges to the will, family pressure to isolate David and me, and public relations warfare designed to question the legitimacy of Harrison's final wishes. "There's something else," Eleanor continued. "She's been asking questions about the foundation Mr. Harrison established. specifically about your authority to make hiring decisions and allocate resources. I think she's planning to challenge your appointment as president." After hanging up, I found myself pacing our living room, my legal mind automatically shifting into crisis management mode. Victoria was skilled at manipulation and social warfare, but she was about to discover that 3 years of exclusion and humiliation had taught me lessons she never intended. "We need to be strategic about this," I told David, pulling out a legal pad to organize my thoughts. "She's going to attack on multiple fronts, so we need coordinated responses." The first front was family relations. Within hours of the will reading, my phone began ringing with calls from various Hartwell relatives, some offering congratulations, others clearly fishing for information about my intentions, and a few making not-so-subtle suggestions about family unity and the importance of traditional leadership. David's cousin Jennifer called first, her voice warm with genuine enthusiasm. "Emma, I can't tell you how thrilled I am about grandfather's decision. After watching how you've been treated these past 3 years, seeing you vindicated like this, it's justice." But the call from David's cousin Marcus was significantly different in tone. "Look, Emma," he said, his voice carrying the entitled edge I'd come to associate with Victoria's allies, "I think we all need to sit down and discuss how to handle this situation. Grandfather obviously wasn't thinking clearly in his final months, and we need to find a way to honor his memory while making practical decisions about the family's future." The subtext was clear. Marcus had been enlisted by Victoria to begin building a coalition against Harrison's wishes. When I politely declined his suggestion for an immediate family meeting, his tone turned cooler. "I hope you understand that disrupting family harmony for personal gain won't be tolerated indefinitely. There are ways to resolve these issues that you might find uncomfortable." After ending the call, I made careful notes about the conversation. If Victoria was recruiting family members to pressure or threaten me, I wanted everything documented for potential legal action. The second front was business operations. As a major shareholder, I now had rights to information about Hartwell Industries' finances, strategic plans, and operational decisions. When I contacted the company's chief financial officer to schedule a briefing on current business status, I discovered that Victoria had already been there first. "Mrs. Hartwell," the CFO said carefully when I reached him, "I've been instructed by Mrs. Victoria that all information requests need to be cleared through her office first, given the unusual circumstances surrounding the will." "I see," I replied calmly. "And who gave Mrs. Victoria authority to control information access for shareholders?" The pause that followed told me everything I needed to know. Victoria was already attempting to use her position as family matriarch to override my legal rights as a business owner. "I'll be sending you a formal request for shareholder information within the hour," I continued. "Please ensure it receives appropriate legal review, as any attempts to deny legitimate shareholder rights could result in significant legal consequences." The third front was public relations. By evening, I'd received calls from 2 business reporters asking about irregularities in Harrison Hartwell's estate planning and questions about my qualifications to manage significant business interests. Victoria's media campaign was designed to paint me as an opportunistic outsider who had somehow manipulated a vulnerable elderly man. "Mrs. Hartwell," said the reporter from the Wall Street Journal, "sources close to the family suggest that your inheritance was unexpected and potentially influenced by factors other than Mr. Harrison's independent judgment. Would you care to comment?" "I'd be happy to comment," I replied, drawing on my years of media training from high-profile legal cases. "Mr. Harrison spent considerable time documenting his decisions and the reasoning behind them. Any questions about his mental competency or judgment can be addressed through the extensive medical and legal evaluations he commissioned specifically to prevent such challenges." I also made sure the reporter understood that I had copies of all documentation supporting Harrison's decisions, including evidence of the behavior that had influenced his choices. The implicit threat was clear. If Victoria wanted to fight this battle in the media, I had ammunition she might not want made public. But Victoria's most sophisticated attack came through what appeared to be family reconciliation. On Sunday morning, she called David directly, her voice carefully modulated to convey maternal concern rather than fury. "Darling," she said, her tone carrying just the right mix of sadness and hope. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and I realize I may have misunderstood your grandfather's intentions. Perhaps we should all sit down together and discuss how to move forward as a family." David looked at me questioningly as he put the call on speaker. We both recognized this as a tactical shift, Victoria moving from direct confrontation to apparent conciliation. "I'd like to invite you and Emma for dinner tonight," she continued. "Just family, no lawyers or outside parties. A chance for us to talk honestly about grandfather's wishes and how we can honor them while maintaining family unity." It was beautifully played, reasonable, conciliatory, and designed to make us look petty if we refused. But I'd spent 3 years learning to recognize Victoria's strategic retreats, and this had all the hallmarks of a trap. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mother," David replied carefully. "But given the complexity of the estate issues, I think we should probably keep discussions formal and include legal counsel." The slight hardening in Victoria's voice revealed her frustration with his response. "Oh, David, surely we don't need lawyers to have a family conversation. I'm simply trying to understand Emma's plans for the foundation and her role in the business. As family members, we should be able to discuss these things openly." After David declined the dinner invitation, Victoria's mask slipped just enough to reveal the steel underneath. "I hope you both understand that family loyalty goes both ways. Grandfather may have made certain provisions, but family dynamics are more complex than legal documents can address." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Victoria was reminding us that she still held considerable influence over family relationships, business connections, and social standing. Legal inheritance was one thing. Actually exercising power in the face of organized family resistance was quite another. That afternoon, I received an unexpected visitor. Charles Hartwell stood at our front door, looking older and more tired than Bao I'd ever seen him. "Emma," he said heavily, "I wonder if we might talk privately. There are things Victoria doesn't know I'm saying, things that need to be said." We sat in our living room while David remained diplomatically absent, giving his father space to speak freely. "Victoria is planning something significant," Charles began without preamble. "She's convinced that Harrison's will can be overturned or at least modified through family pressure and legal challenges. But more than that, she's planning to make your life so difficult that you'll voluntarily relinquish your inheritance to preserve your marriage and your sanity." I'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed by Charles was sobering. "She's already contacted 3 different law firms about challenging the will," he continued. When they told her the document was legally ironclad, she shifted to what she calls alternative strategies: systematic exclusion from family events, pressure on business partners, social isolation designed to force you out. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked directly. Charles was quiet for a long moment, staring out our window at the October afternoon. "Because I watched what she did to Richard's wife, and William's second wife, and half a dozen other women who married into this family over the years. I told myself it was just Victoria's way, that she'd eventually come around. But Harrison was right. It's not protectiveness, it's cruelty." He turned to meet my eyes directly. "My father-in-law saw something in you that impressed him enough to restructure his entire estate. The least I can do is warn you about what's coming and offer whatever support I can provide." Charles's warning proved prescient. Over the following week, Victoria's campaign intensified on multiple fronts. Family members began canceling social plans with David and me, citing vague scheduling conflicts. Business associates who had previously been warm and welcoming suddenly became formal and distant. Invitations to charity events and social gatherings that would normally have included us simply stopped arriving. More troubling were the subtle but persistent questions about Harrison's mental state in his final months. Victoria had begun spreading carefully worded concerns about his judgment, his susceptibility to influence, and his departure from family traditions. She never made direct accusations, but the cumulative effect was to plant seeds of doubt about the legitimacy of his final wishes. "She's trying to isolate us socially while building a narrative that grandfather wasn't competent to make these decisions," I explained to David as we reviewed the pattern of responses we'd been receiving. "It's actually quite sophisticated. She's attacking both our social standing and the legal basis for the inheritance simultaneously." But Victoria had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that I would respond to exclusion and pressure, the same way I had during our early years, with patience, diplomacy, and attempts at reconciliation. She hadn't accounted for the fact that Harrison's inheritance had fundamentally changed not just my financial position, but my willingness to tolerate systematic mistreatment. When the next family gathering was announced, a birthday celebration, for one of David's cousins, and our invitation was notably absent, I decided it was time to exercise my new power. I called the family member directly, expressing surprise that we hadn't received an invitation to such an important celebration. When she stammered about limited space and complicated family dynamics, I made my position clear. "I understand that Victoria has been organizing these events," I said calmly. "But I think it's important for everyone to understand that systematically, excluding family members, particularly based on personal disputes, violates the family unity provisions that Harrison included in his will. As co-executor of his estate, I have a responsibility to ensure those provisions are honored." The implied threat was clear. Continued exclusion could affect inheritance distributions for everyone involved. Within hours, we received a formal invitation to the birthday celebration. But Victoria's most direct challenge came through the foundation Harrison had established. As president of the organization dedicated to supporting victims of workplace harassment and social exclusion, I had broad authority to hire staff, allocate resources, and establish operational priorities. Victoria clearly saw this as both a threat and an opportunity. She requested a meeting to discuss coordination between the foundation and the family's existing charitable activities. When we met at the foundation's temporary offices, her approach was characteristically strategic. "Emma, dear," she began, her tone carefully modulated to sound collaborative. "I'm concerned that you might not fully understand the complexities of managing a large charitable organization. The family has decades of experience with philanthropic work, and I'd hate to see grandfather's generous bequest wasted through inexperience." She went on to suggest that the foundation should be managed by the family's existing charitable board, with herself as chairwoman and me in a more symbolic role. It was a sophisticated attempt to neutralize the one area where I had independent authority while maintaining the appearance of family cooperation. "That's very thoughtful," I replied, making notes as she spoke. But Harrison was quite specific about wanting the foundation to operate independently, with fresh perspectives on addressing systemic harassment and exclusion. I think he felt that traditional approaches might not be sufficient for the problems he wanted to address. Victoria's smile became strained. "Of course, but surely you recognize the value of experienced guidance. These issues are more complex than they might appear to someone from a different background." There it was, the subtle reminder that I remained an outsider, regardless of inheritance or legal authority. But this time, instead of the familiar sting of exclusion, I felt something approaching pity for her desperate attempts to maintain control. "Actually," I said, closing my notebook and preparing to end the meeting, "I think Harrison chose me precisely because of my different background. He wanted someone who understood exclusion and harassment from personal experience, not from the perspective of those who've traditionally held power." As Victoria left the foundation offices, her composure finally cracking enough to reveal the Fury underneath, I realized that we'd reached a turning point. The gloves were coming off on both sides, and the real battle for the future of the Hartwell family was about to begin. But for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't fighting from a position of weakness. I had resources, legal authority, and most importantly, the moral clarity that comes from knowing you're fighting for justice rather than just personal acceptance. Victoria Hartwell was about to discover that her campaign of exclusion and humiliation had created an enemy far more formidable than she'd ever imagined. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in November, when Victoria made the tactical error that would ultimately destroy her carefully maintained facade. I was in my new office at the foundation, reviewing applications from our first round of grant requests, when Eleanor Whitfield called with news that changed everything. "Mrs. Emma," Eleanor's voice was shaking with barely controlled anger. "You need to see the morning's New York Post. Mrs. Victoria has given an interview that, well, it's exactly what we feared." The article, spread across the society pages with an accompanying photo of Victoria looking dignified and grief-stricken, was a masterpiece of calculated character assassination. Under the headline, "Family Fortune Feud, Widow Questions Inheritance," surprise! Victoria had painted herself as the grieving daughter-in-law protecting her late father-in-law's legacy from an opportunistic newcomer. "Harrison was such a trusting soul in his final years," she was quoted as saying. "He was always so eager to help people he saw as disadvantaged. I'm afraid someone may have taken advantage of his generous nature and his diminished awareness of family dynamics." The article went on to describe me as a career-focused lawyer from a modest background who had somehow convinced the elderly patriarch to restructure his will in ways that shocked longtime family members. Victoria had managed to plant seeds of doubt about Harrison's mental capacity while positioning herself as the defender of family values and traditions, but it was the final paragraph that revealed Victoria's fatal miscalculation. Mrs. Victoria. Hartwell emphasized that she harbors no personal animosity toward her daughter-in-law, noting that Emma's different background and limited understanding of family traditions may have led to misunderstandings about appropriate roles and expectations. "We've always tried to include her," she said, "but some people simply aren't comfortable with the responsibilities that come with a prominent family name." The lies were so blatant, so easily disprovable with the documentation Harrison had compiled, that I almost felt grateful to Victoria for overplaying her hand so dramatically. "She's handed us everything we need," I told David as we sat in our study that evening, the newspaper spread between us alongside file folders full of evidence. "Every claim she made in this article can be contradicted with photographic evidence, witness testimony, and recorded conversations." David nodded grimly, studying a photo from our wedding day that clearly showed Victoria orchestrating my exclusion from family portraits. She's been so used to controlling the narrative that she forgot other people might have different versions of events. "More than that," I said, pulling up the Foundation's new website on my laptop. "She's given us the perfect platform to tell our side of the story." The Hartwell Foundation for Workplace Justice had officially launched the previous week with a professional website, dedicated staff, and a mission statement that explicitly addressed systematic exclusion and harassment. What Victoria didn't know was that our launch had included a comprehensive media strategy designed to raise awareness about workplace bullying and social intimidation. "We're going to respond to her interview," I announced, my decision crystallizing as I spoke. "But not defensively. We're going to use this as an opportunity to launch our public education campaign about systematic exclusion and family bullying." The response I crafted was strategically devastating. Rather than simply denying Victoria's claims, I positioned the Foundation's work within the broader context of institutional bullying and systematic exclusion. The press release, issued 2 days after Victoria's interview, included carefully selected examples of documented harassment patterns, supported by photographic evidence and witness statements that Harrison had meticulously compiled. The Hartwell Foundation was established by Harrison Hartwell specifically to address patterns of systematic exclusion and social intimidation that he witnessed firsthand, the release stated. Our founder documented extensive evidence of how institutional power can be used to marginalize and isolate individuals who don't conform to narrow definitions of acceptability. I'd attached selected portions of Harrison's documentation, wedding photos showing deliberate exclusion, email chains revealing strategic planning to undermine relationships, and audio recordings of conversations where family members openly discussed methods for maintaining social hierarchy through systematic rejection. The media response was immediate and explosive. Within hours, the story had evolved from a simple inheritance dispute to a case study in family bullying and institutional manipulation. Harrison's documentation was so comprehensive and damning that Victoria's narrative collapsed under the weight of contradictory evidence. "Holy shit," David said, reading news coverage on his phone as calls poured in from reporters requesting interviews. Look at this headline: Society Matriarch's 3-year campaign of exclusion exposed through family documents. She's not just losing this battle, she's being destroyed. But Victoria's response to the media exposure revealed just how far she was willing to go to maintain control. Instead of retreating or attempting damage control, she doubled down with a strategy that was both more desperate and more dangerous than anything she'd attempted before. The attack came through David's career. On Thursday morning, he received a call from his supervisor at the law firm where he'd worked for 6 years, requesting an immediate meeting to discuss concerns about his professional judgment and family associations. They wouldn't give me specifics over the phone, David explained as he prepared to leave for what we both knew would be a termination meeting. But Victoria has obviously been working her contacts to create professional consequences for the media coverage. I watched him drive away, knowing that Victoria had calculated this move carefully. By attacking David's career, she was attempting to create economic pressure that would force us to accept her terms or face financial ruin despite the inheritance. But Victoria had miscalculated again. The foundation's board of directors included several prominent employment attorneys who specialized in retaliation cases, and within hours of David's termination, we had filed suit against his former firm for wrongful dismissal based on family association and protected activity. The timing is so obvious, explained Jennifer Morrison, the employment attorney who took David's case. He gets fired 3 days after his wife exposes documented harassment patterns? That's textbook retaliation, and we have discovery rights that will allow us to examine all communications between the firm's management and Mrs. Victoria. More importantly, David's termination had backfired spectacularly from a public relations standpoint. The story of a lawyer being fired because his wife exposed family bullying patterns fit perfectly into broader conversations about institutional retaliation and systematic silencing of harassment victims. Victoria's biggest mistake, I explained to the reporter from the Times during a follow-up interview, is that she's still operating as if this were a private family dispute that could be resolved through traditional power dynamics. She hasn't recognized that by making it public, she's turned it into a case study that helps illustrate exactly the kind of behavior our foundation was created to address. The reporter's questions were pointed and well-informed. Your documentation suggests this pattern of exclusion has been ongoing for years, affecting multiple family members. Is this about more than just personal grievances? Absolutely, I replied, consulting the carefully prepared talking points our media consultant had developed. Harrison Hartwell spent his final years documenting systematic patterns of behavior that extended far beyond any individual relationship. He saw how institutional power could be used to silence dissent, marginalize inconvenient voices, and maintain hierarchy through systematic cruelty. The interview was scheduled to run as part of a larger series on institutional bullying, which meant Victoria's behavior would be analyzed alongside corporate harassment cases, political retaliation campaigns, and other examples of systematic exclusion. She was no longer just a difficult mother-in-law. She was becoming a case study in how privileged individuals abuse social power. But Victoria's most devastating mistake was still to come. On Friday afternoon, she called a press conference at the family estate, apparently intending to regain control of the narrative through what she termed setting the record straight. Standing in the same garden where our wedding photos had been taken, surrounded by supporters who represented the old money social network she'd spent decades cultivating, Victoria attempted to present herself as the victim of a calculated campaign to destroy family unity. "I have devoted my life to preserving the values and traditions that make the Hartwell family special," she began, her voice carrying across the assembled reporters with practiced authority. "What we're witnessing now is an attempt to tear down decades of careful stewardship in favor of modern notions that prioritize individual grievances over family harmony. It was a carefully crafted message designed to appeal to conservative social values and traditional family structures." Victoria was positioning herself as the defender of established order against the forces of change and individual entitlement. But then she made the fatal error that would end her campaign permanently. "I want to address directly the allegations that have been made about my treatment of family members," she continued, her confidence building as she moved into what she clearly saw as her strongest material. "Every family has protocols and traditions that help maintain unity and appropriate boundaries. Sometimes these protocols require difficult conversations about roles and expectations." She paused dramatically, looking directly into the cameras. "When my son married Emma, we welcomed her into our family circle as warmly as we could. But there are certain responsibilities and behavioral expectations that come with the Hartwell name, and frankly, not everyone is prepared for those demands. We tried to provide guidance and support, but some people interpret structure as rejection." The statement was devastating in its revealing honesty. Victoria had essentially admitted to imposing behavioral expectations and protocols that were designed to control family members' conduct. More damning, she'd acknowledged that what others might see as rejection was actually intentional structure designed to enforce compliance. "Furthermore," she continued, apparently unaware of how damaging her admissions were becoming, "I think it's important to understand that family photographs and social events serve important functions in maintaining continuity and traditions. These aren't casual snapshots. They're historical documents that reflect family values and priorities across generations." She had just publicly confirmed on camera that the wedding photo exclusions were deliberate choices based on family values and priorities, rather than innocent oversights or space limitations. I watched the press conference from the foundation, offices surrounded by staff members whose expressions of amazement mirrored my own. Victoria was systematically destroying her own defense, providing direct admissions of the systematic exclusion that Harrison had documented so carefully. "My God," whispered Sarah Chen, the foundation's communications director. "She's literally confirming every allegation while thinking she's defending herself." The coup de grace came when a reporter asked Victoria directly about the wedding photography incident that had become symbolic of the broader pattern of exclusion. "Mrs. Hartwell," the reporter said, "the documentation released by the foundation includes photographs from your son's wedding that appear to show deliberate exclusion of the bride from family portraits. Can you explain the reasoning behind that decision?" Victoria's response revealed the fundamental arrogance that had driven her campaign of exclusion for 3 years. "As I mentioned, family portraits serve historical purposes. We wanted to preserve traditional family documentation before expanding to include newer additions. It's simply a matter of maintaining proper records and ensuring that future generations understand the family's core structure." She had just admitted on camera to deliberately excluding her son's bride from family wedding portraits because she considered me a newer addition rather than a full family member. The admission was so damaging that even her supporters began exchanging uncomfortable glances. But Victoria wasn't finished. Perhaps sensing that she was losing her audience, she made one final attempt to assert her authority. "I want to be absolutely clear about something. The Hartwell family has maintained its position and reputation for 5 generations through careful attention to tradition, protocol, and appropriate behavior. We will not allow that legacy to be destroyed by individuals who prioritize personal grievances over family unity, regardless of what financial resources they may have acquired through questionable circumstances." The implication that Harrison's inheritance represented questionable circumstances was legally actionable defamation, but more immediately, it revealed the depth of Victoria's contempt for both her late father-in-law's judgment and his explicit wishes for family inclusion and justice. As the press conference ended and reporters began filing stories that would dominate the next news cycle, I realized that Victoria had accomplished something I never could have achieved through strategic planning. She had publicly revealed the calculated cruelty behind her systematic campaign of exclusion, while simultaneously insulting the memory and judgment of the family patriarch who had tried to correct her behavior. "She's finished," David said as we watched the evening news coverage from our living room. "Not just in terms of public opinion, but legally. She's provided so much admissible evidence of intentional discrimination and defamation that our attorneys are probably celebrating right now." The next morning brought confirmation that Victoria's press conference had backfired catastrophically. Editorial coverage was uniformly critical, social media reaction ranged from mockery to outrage, and several prominent social organizations had quietly rescinded invitations to events where Victoria was scheduled to appear. More significantly, Charles called to request an emergency meeting. When he arrived at our townhouse that afternoon, he looked like a man who had aged years in a matter of days. "Victoria has lost her mind," he said, without preamble. "Yesterday's press conference was completely unauthorized. I knew nothing about it until I saw it on the news. The family's reputation is in ruins. Our business relationships are being questioned, and she's created legal liability for defamation and potentially securities fraud." He paused, running his hands through his gray hair. "I'm here to formally apologize for everything that's happened and to discuss how we can begin repairing the damage she's caused, both to your personal relationship with the family and to the family's public standing." It was the conversation I'd waited 3 years to have, the acknowledgement of systematic mistreatment that had been so long denied. But as Charles spoke, I realized that vindication felt different than I'd expected. Instead of satisfaction, I felt something approaching sadness for the destruction that Victoria's pride and cruelty had ultimately caused. "The question now," Charles continued, "is whether there's any way to move forward constructively, or whether Victoria's behavior has created irreparable damage to family relationships." As I considered his question, I looked around our living room at the evidence files, legal documents, and media coverage that chronicled 3 years of systematic exclusion and the dramatic reversal of fortune that had followed. Victoria's campaign had not only failed, it had spectacularly backfired, creating exactly the kind of public accountability and institutional change that Harrison had hoped to inspire. But the real question wasn't whether the damage was irreparable. The question was what kind of family we wanted to build from the ruins of the old hierarchy, and whether Victoria could ever accept a world where cruelty had consequences and exclusion was no longer tolerated. The final chapter of our story was about to be written, and for the first time in 3 years I held the pen. 6 months after Victoria's catastrophic press conference, I stood in the same garden where our wedding photos had been taken, but this time the occasion was entirely different. The Hartwell Foundation was hosting its first annual symposium on systematic exclusion and workplace justice, and the estate, now under Charles's management following Victoria's quiet withdrawal from public life, had been transformed into a venue dedicated to the cause Harrison had championed. "The irony is almost too perfect," Eleanor Whitfield observed, approaching with a cup of coffee as we watched the final preparations for the morning's opening session. "The same space where you were excluded from family photos is now hosting An international conference on inclusion and justice. I nodded, studying the elegant banners and professional displays that had replaced the traditional family gatherings. Over 300 attendees from around the world had come to New York for the symposium: employment attorneys, HR professionals, workplace advocates, and survivors of systematic harassment who were ready to share their stories and strategies. Mrs. Emma called Dr. Sarah Martinez, the Foundation's newly hired executive director. The keynote speakers are ready for their final briefing. Should we gather in the main conference room? As I walked through the estate's halls, now bustling with purposeful activity rather than social maneuvering, I reflected on how completely the landscape had changed. The formal portraits that once excluded me had been supplemented with new displays showcasing the Foundation's work, images of diverse professionals, inclusion ceremonies, and documentation of positive change in workplaces around the country. The legal aftermath of Victoria's press conference had been swift and decisive. Her recorded admissions of systematic exclusion had not only supported our defamation case, but had also triggered investigations into discriminatory practices at 3 companies where Hartwell family members served on boards. The Foundation had become a clearinghouse for similar cases, with our legal team now handling dozens of systematic exclusion lawsuits across multiple industries. The settlement figures are final, reported James Patterson, our lead litigation attorney, as the legal team gathered for our weekly briefing. The wrongful termination case against David's former firm resulted in a 7-figure payout, which they've agreed to donate directly to the Foundation. More importantly, they've implemented comprehensive anti-retaliation policies and agreed to serve as a case study for our best practices program. David had initially been devastated by his termination, but the forced career change had ultimately liberated him from a position where family pressure and business politics had limited his potential. He was now serving as the Foundation's general counsel, applying his legal expertise to cases that actually mattered to him rather than simply advancing corporate interests. The Williams case goes to trial next month, he updated the team, referencing a particularly egregious example of workplace exclusion we'd taken on. The discovery phase revealed systematic patterns of isolation and marginalization that make Victoria's behavior look amateur by comparison. That comparison had become a frequent reference point in our work. Victoria's documented campaign against me had become a textbook example of how institutional power could be weaponized for personal cruelty, and the extensive evidence Harrison had compiled was now being used to train investigators and advocates working on similar cases. But perhaps the most significant development had been entirely unexpected. 3 weeks after Victoria's press conference disaster, I received a call from someone I'd never expected to hear from again. "Mrs. Hartwell? This is Patricia Morrison, Richard's ex-wife." The voice was tentative but determined. "I saw the news, coverage about your situation, and I think we need to talk." Patricia Morrison had been married to David's cousin Richard for 3 years before their divorce, and like the other women who had been driven from the family, she had disappeared, quietly without explanation. But Victoria's public exposure had apparently given her the courage to break her silence. "She did the same thing to me," Patricia explained during our meeting at a quiet cafe in Manhattan. "The systematic exclusion, the impossible standards, the way she made me feel like I was contaminating the family just by existing. When Richard and I divorced, I signed a non-disclosure agreement about family matters in exchange for a settlement. But watching what she tried to do to you, I can't stay silent anymore." Patricia's testimony had opened floodgates. Within weeks, we were contacted by 4 other former family members who had similar stories of systematic exclusion, impossible expectations, and eventual expulsion from the Hartwell circle. Each had signed NDAs as part of their divorce settlements, but Victoria's public admissions had potentially voided the confidentiality provisions. "We're looking at a pattern of behavior spanning 2 decades, our investigative team reported. At least 7 women married into the Hartwell family during that period, and only 2 remained, both after accepting severely diminished roles and essentially capitulating to Mrs. Victoria's demands. The The revelation had transformed our case from a personal dispute into a broader examination of how institutional power could be systematically abused over extended periods. Victoria hadn't just targeted me. She had conducted a decades-long campaign to maintain family hierarchy through calculated cruelty. But the most powerful vindication came from an unexpected source: the family itself. The annual Hartwell Christmas gathering, traditionally held at the estate under Victoria's rigid orchestration, had been reimagined as a celebration of inclusion and healing. For the first time in family history, the guest list included former spouses, estranged relatives, and family members who had been marginalized or excluded under the previous regime. "This is how Christmas should be," David's cousin Jennifer observed, as we watched children from multiple generations playing together in the same garden where formal family hierarchies had once been rigidly enforced. Messy, loud, real, not some sterile performance designed to impress photographers. The contrast with previous gatherings was striking. Instead of carefully choreographed seating arrangements designed to reinforce status differences, tables were organized around shared interests and genuine relationships. Rather than formal portraits emphasizing bloodline hierarchies, candid photography captured authentic moments of connection and joy. Most significantly, Victoria was notably absent. Following her press conference disaster, she had retreated to the family's Martha's Vineyard property, emerging only for required legal proceedings and maintaining a silence that spoke volumes about her recognition of complete defeat. "She's finished," Charles had explained during one of our regular reconciliation meetings. "Not just publicly, but within the family. The younger generation has made it clear that they want nothing to do with the kind of behavior she represented, and even her traditional allies have distanced themselves." Charles himself had emerged as an unexpected champion of reform, using his position as family patriarch to implement changes that went far beyond mere inclusion policies. The family's charitable foundations had been restructured to prioritize justice and equality causes, business practices had been reviewed for discriminatory patterns, and family governance had been completely overhauled to prevent the kind of systematic abuse Victoria had perfected. "I spent too many years enabling behavior I knew was wrong," he admitted during our private conversation. "Your grandfather saw what I was too cowardly to confront, and he used his final act to force the accountability I should have demanded decades ago." The transformation extended beyond family dynamics to broader social impact. The Hartwell Foundation had become a leading voice in the movement against systematic exclusion, with our work cited in employment law cases, corporate training programs, and academic research on institutional bullying. "We're getting calls from companies, schools, and organizations around the world," reported Dr. Martinez during our quarterly board meeting. "Everyone wants to understand how to identify and prevent the kind of systematic exclusion patterns we've documented." Our educational programs had reached thousands of professionals. Our legal advocacy had secured justice for dozens of systematic exclusion victims, and our research had contributed to policy changes in multiple jurisdictions. Harrison's $50 million investment in justice had generated returns he never could have imagined. But the most meaningful vindication came from personal relationships that had been rebuilt on foundations of respect rather than hierarchy. "I owe you an enormous debt," David's cousin Marcus told me during the reformed Christmas gathering, his previous entitlement replaced by genuine humility. "Watching how you handled everything Victoria threw at you, seeing your grace under pressure, it made me realize what kind of person I wanted to become." Marcus had used his trust fund inheritance to establish a scholarship program for students from backgrounds similar to mine, specifically targeting brilliant individuals who might face class-based exclusion in elite educational settings. Several other family members had made similar gestures, as if trying to atone for years of passive complicity in Victoria's behavior. "The family is finally becoming what grandfather always hoped it could be," Eleanor observed, as we watched the multi-generational celebration unfold around us. "Inclusive, generous, focused on lifting others up rather than keeping them out. As the evening wound down and families began gathering their belongings, David found me standing in the same spot where our wedding photographer had captured my exclusion from family portraits. The contrast between that day and this celebration felt almost surreal. "Any regrets?" he asked, slipping his arm around my waist as we watched our young nephews and nieces playing games that included everyone regardless of bloodline or social status. I considered the question seriously. The 3 years of systematic exclusion had been genuinely painful. The battles with Victoria had been exhausting, and the public exposure had been invasive and uncomfortable. But the ultimate outcome had exceeded my wildest hopes for justice and change. "No regrets," I replied finally. "If we hadn't gone through all of that, none of this would exist. The foundation, the legal precedents, the cultural change, the reformed family dynamics. Victoria's cruelty inadvertently created something much more powerful than she ever imagined." David nodded, studying the transformed garden where inclusion had replaced hierarchy as the organizing principle. "Grandfather would be proud." "I think he is proud," I said, thinking of Harrison's final letter and his belief that justice delayed was not justice denied. He gambled everything on the idea that exposing systematic cruelty would ultimately create systematic change. He was right. As we prepared to leave that evening, I took one final look around the estate that had been the site of so much pain and transformation. The formal portraits still lined the hallways, but they'd been supplemented with new images that told a different story: celebrations of inclusion, documentation of positive change, and evidence that families could evolve beyond their worst. Traditions. The Hartwell name, once associated with exclusive social hierarchy and calculated exclusion, had become synonymous with justice advocacy and institutional reform. Victoria's campaign to preserve family traditions had ultimately destroyed those traditions entirely, replacing them with values that actually deserved preservation. 6 months later, I received an unexpected letter delivered to the foundation offices. The return address showed Martha's Vineyard, and the handwriting was unmistakably Victoria's. Emma. I am writing this letter because my attorneys have advised that it may be beneficial for future legal proceedings, but also because I have had considerable time to reflect on recent events. I will not apologize for defending family traditions that I believed were important, but I acknowledge that my methods may have been excessive in their execution. You have demonstrated remarkable resilience and strategic capability in responding to challenges that were perhaps more significant than I initially realized. The family's transformation under your influence has been comprehensive and, I must admit, generally positive. The Foundation's work appears to be having meaningful impact, and the reformed family dynamics seem to have created greater unity than the previous structures achieved. I do not expect forgiveness, nor am I requesting reconciliation. But I wanted you to know that I recognize the legitimacy of your position within the family and respect what you have accomplished with the resources Harrison provided. This letter should not be interpreted as an admission of legal liability, but rather as an acknowledgement that you have proven yourself worthy of the Hartwell name in ways I was too stubborn to recognize earlier. Victoria Hartwell. I read the letter twice, searching for hidden meanings or strategic implications, but ultimately concluded that it was exactly what it appeared to be: the surrender of someone who had finally recognized the completeness of her defeat. She's actually admitting you belong in the family, David observed when I showed him the letter. After everything we've been through, she's finally acknowledging what should have been obvious from the day we got married. But the letter felt less like victory than closure. Victoria's acknowledgement was gratifying, but it was no longer necessary for my sense of belonging or self-worth. The Foundation's work, the reformed family dynamics, and the broader social impact we'd created had provided validation far more meaningful than her approval could ever have been. 2 years later, as I stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council presenting our research on systematic exclusion and institutional Bullying. I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. What had begun as a personal battle against family rejection had evolved into a global movement for inclusion and justice. Systematic exclusion operates through seemingly minor actions that accumulate into devastating psychological and economic impact, I explained to the international audience. A wedding photo exclusion, a strategic seating arrangement, a pattern of dismissive comments. Individually, these might seem petty. Collectively, they constitute a form of institutional violence that destroys careers, relationships, and human dignity. The presentation included anonymized case studies from our work, including the patterns we'd identified in the Hartwell family dynamics. Victoria's behavior had become a teaching tool, helping others recognize and respond to similar forms of systematic cruelty. But the most important lesson we've learned, I continued, is that systematic exclusion ultimately defeats itself when confronted with systematic documentation, strategic resistance, and unwavering commitment to justice. Institutional bullies rely on silence, isolation, and the assumption that their victims will eventually surrender. When those assumptions prove false, their entire system of control collapses. The response was overwhelming. Delegates from dozens of countries requested copies of our research, several governments announced new anti-exclusion initiatives, and multiple international organizations committed funding for similar programs in their regions. As I fielded questions from the audience, I thought about the woman who had stood in a wedding dress 4 years earlier, watching her new family systematically exclude her from their photographs and their lives. That woman had believed that acceptance required surrender, that belonging demanded silence, that love meant tolerating systematic cruelty. She had been wrong about all of it. True belonging wasn't granted by others. It was claimed through integrity, defended through courage, and sustained through the commitment to ensure that others never faced similar battles alone. The family I had ultimately joined wasn't defined by bloodline or social position, but by shared values of inclusion, justice, and mutual respect. Victoria's systematic exclusion had been designed to drive me away from the Hartwell family. Instead, it had transformed that family into something worthy of belonging to, created a global movement for justice, and established a legacy that would protect countless others from facing similar cruelty. Standing before the United Nations Assembly, representing an organization built from the ashes of systematic exclusion, I realized that Harrison Hartwell's final gamble had paid dividends beyond his wildest imagination. Justice delayed had indeed not been justice denied. It had been justice amplified, justice systematized, and justice made permanent. The wedding photos that once excluded me had become evidence in landmark legal cases. The family that once rejected me had become champions of inclusion. The woman who tried to destroy my sense of belonging had inadvertently created a worldwide movement dedicated to ensuring that belonging was a right, not a privilege. And somewhere in Martha's Vineyard, Victoria Hartwell was presumably reading news coverage of my UN presentation, finally understanding the magnitude of what her systematic cruelty had ultimately accomplished. The story that began with exclusion from family photographs had ended with inclusion in the permanent record of international human rights advocacy. It was, I reflected with deep satisfaction, exactly the kind of poetic justice that Harrison Hartwell would have appreciated. The best revenge, it turned out, wasn't just success. It was transformation so complete that your enemies ultimately became unwitting architects of the very change they had tried to prevent. And that transformation would continue long after all of us were gone, ensuring that future generations would inherit a world where systematic exclusion was not just recognized as wrong, but actively prevented through the systems we had built from our pain. It was, in every sense, a legacy worthy of the Hartwell. Name, the name I had fought to earn, claimed through courage, and ultimately redefined entirely. The end up next. You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click. and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.